as a medic, I could have been assigned to anything. I could have been assigned to a grunt unit. For reasons that no one will ever know, in the lottery, I was assigned to a tank, one of two tank battalions in Vietnam, which was both incredibly fortunate for protecting me and totally absurd because the tanks were just about useless in the swampy terrain. And so it was kind of at times a bit comical, but it was also, as I say, lucky. We had very few casualties. The tanks, someone said, wouldn't the Viet Cong want to attack a tank? And I said, don't be stupid. The only thing the Viet Cong wanted to attack were helicopters. They wouldn't waste their time on tanks. Some of it was just the inappropriateness of using tanks, so sort of sending them out at night, as they say, on a kind of ambush watch or something. A huge tank, maybe several tanks pointed in different directions, in a large open field, staying the men staying awake all night if they could, waiting to shoot something or someone, and no one would come because, as I said, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were not stupid. What they would do is try to destroy helicopters on the helicopter pads, which is why in a base camp you didn't ever want to be near one in your billet. So that was absurd. But that was the nature of using the tanks. But the problem was that the Vietnam War at the time was the only war we had, and the opportunists among the lifers, both the non-commissioned but especially the commissioned officers, everyone wanted to get into the act. So get their medals, get their, put it on their resume. So the tank people, at least two battalions, don't remember where the other one was. This one was 25th Division and 3 Corps. They wanted to be there, so there they were. The other thing of absurdity was just the bureaucracy and the paperwork of what was going on in the battalion. You had some wonderfully fine, upstanding officers and NCOs, and you also had some kind of sleazebags who were corrupt and making money, selling stuff on the black market out of supply, or trying to get phony awards, or basically just trying to log in time in the helicopter to say that they have been doing things. So they're advancing themselves in various ways, and some of it, as I said, was patently dishonest.
Part of what you're getting at here, that there's an ideal, but then you get on the ground and what you see is a lot of, at least what you're describing in this instance, you're seeing a lot of self-interested,
Yeah. Yeah.
short-term thinking that seems to go against the ideal.
Well, that's a wonderful point. The thing about the Vietnam phenomenon, and it applies to many other things in history, is two or three things can be valid and happening coexisting at the same time.
Mhm.
You had some people in the army, some civilians, some people in government who really felt that we were the American support and American military action was an assistance, was an aid to keeping a government that we approved of and we hoped free and etc. Others, but at the same time, we in Vietnam did not understand anything about the country, or very little. We didn't understand the language. We didn't understand the culture. We didn't understand the recent history. We didn't understand the divisions within the populace of Vietnam. And I have said this when I've been in public talking about my observation of Vietnam, aside from being a medic. I said basically, as we look back on it, what we actually stumbled into, maybe with good intentions, in some cases opportunistically, in other cases, it's kind of good intentions, but we didn't understand what we stumbled into was partly an anti-colonialist war, continuing, from when they threw out the French and Dien Bien Phu, and a civil war, which is to say the people of South Vietnam themselves were divided. So you had an anti-colonialist war, which some people, North and South, were fighting, and you had a civil war where factions within South Vietnam were opposed to each other, and you also had peasants and others who probably were indifferent, just wanted to be left alone. But it was that kind of complexity. How could the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army ultimately have survived that long because it stuck it out to the point where the United States, withdrew its military activity in 73, and then 2 years later, Saigon fell in 75. Well, it could not have happened at all if there hadn't been the complexity of a combination of the continuation of the anti-colonialist war that went way back to the French, and a civil war, divisions politically within South Vietnam. Another kind of absurdity were the accidents, and the tragic accidents. People being, one time I was at a fire support base, and they were firing out into the woods at night, not knowing, just to shoot up the guns into the darkness. And one of the turrets was turned sideways instead of out, and they shot and wounded, luckily didn't kill, wounded some other Americans. And in fact, in the tank battalion, we had very few fatalities, but there may have been 4 over the period, which is very small. But 2 of them were men who were killed by or run over by our own tanks by accident. It was horrible. And I said, that is absurd. You don't,
Sure.
you know, allow this sort of thing to happen. And of course, I, as a medic, had to, sort of clean up some of that or deal with it, and it was quite unpleasant. Every person's story and their experience in Vietnam is valid for him or her and deserves respect. They can have attitudes, and they can have interpretations politically or ideologically about who won, who lost, that sort of thing. That also is, you have to accept. But their experience, their stories, are valid for them. They deserve respect. And there were many situations where they did admirable things. I was very respectful and very fond of the men I served with, and especially, even the ones I didn't always approve of, I was still, fond of them. I was a medic. I had to help and support everybody. It always happens in war. There are acts of courage. There are acts of, of a generosity, of violence, of sharing and defending each other. No question about it. What is it like to be an unarmed, conscientious objector in an army where you might not approve of the policy, going to war, but you're willing to contribute to help other people, especially those in need of attention? And in my case, toward the end, having to identify cadavers, the ultimate respect of the men who were basically killed, often very brutally, and I had to identify them to try to get them onto the next, stage where they would go to graves registration. So these are the stories. They deserve respect.
What was it that led you to be opposed to the war?
Well, basically, yeah, that's a very good point, and I thought a lot about it. I had to make my case, obviously. I had some religious training, and I was kind of more of a churchgoer, but way back then than I am now. But it was part of my formation. My ethical moral foundation was Christianity, but another part of it was just the humanism, the Enlightenment, the thought about uh, the law and violence, and the desire to minimize, you know, resolving things by violence, and also the idea of the restriction against killing. I really didn't want to be involved in any activity that involved killing, but nonetheless, I said, well, I could have applied for 1O and done alternative service, like one of my college roommates actually did, uh, or I could try to weasel out of it. I said, I'm willing to be available for the draft. Something in me said I don't think I can make the case completely for 1O, but I will be willing to serve, because actually I felt it was a patriotic thing to do. I thought that it was humane as well as humanistic to be involved in the medical part to try to help people who were wounded or sick. And I said, well, if I am called on, if I were to be drafted, I would be willing to serve in that regard. So prior to being drafted, I had to make the case, and of course I did. My basic philosophical and moral stance was I was opposed to violence and to killing. Now, that's why I wanted to be a 1AO. I was also opposed to the Vietnam War, not only because it involved violence and killing, but because I had a sense, even if it was perhaps very limited and ignorant, I had a sense that it was futile and foolish, and we were getting into the wrong thing. It was not a defensive war. It was not a, even though the domino theory and the people who said we're defending freedom, all that sort of thing, may have believed it. We, I just had a hunch, had a feeling that we were getting into something that was beyond our comprehension and control. So it was going to be futile and, just a mistake. And I felt that way before I was drafted as the war was evolving. And when I got there, I felt that even more. I said, we can't talk to these people. I don't speak Vietnamese. I had know nothing about these people's lives. I know even less about their government, and so on and so on and so on. We were in a mystery. We were in a labyrinth. And all we did was just sort of trash things, bombs all over the place, Agent Orange, it goes on and on and on. It was very destructive. So, in a way, I think that I was opposed to the war as it being probably a mistake before I entered the army and before I went there. And when I got there, I was even more disillusioned and appalled by the stupidity of it, by the futility of it. What was happening is in all wars, even our own glorious American Revolution, whatever you want to call, is money is changing hands. The war profiteers are profiting, and I saw an absurd waste of money. We had to literally burn and trash usable medications and syringes and things when we were leaving the 25th Division. I was heartbroken. I said, "This is just criminal." So there are things about, well, I'm sure Vietnam War was not that different than Korean War, World War II, World War One in terms of absurdity and waste. But I experienced it because I was there on the ground, and so for me, it was interesting. It was just a further disillusionment, further revelation of what we were dealing with, and all those people. It's you can't bring them back.
What do you suppose? I wouldn't expect that you would remember exactly, more than 50 years later. But as you're on these series of long flights from the States to South Vietnam, what do you suppose your own disposition was? What kinds of things do you think were going through your mind as you were making your way to Vietnam?
I was fearful. Obviously, I was apprehensive. I wasn't panicking. I never panicked, actually. I was very apprehensive, and I was also curious. I said, "What is it? What are we getting into? Where am I going to end up?" For me, the earliest stages of my encounter with Vietnam were a kind of harsh revelations. I sensed that we were getting into a mess. We really didn't know what we were doing, that sort of thing. My uh, One of my first recollections was getting off the air-conditioned airplane when we landed in Tan Son Nhut and just going out into this blast furnace of heat. It was a sudden, how can I say, a baptism, not of fire, baptism of heat, blast furnace. And I said, I'll never get used to this. I did, ultimately. But this this was the awakening. This is my welcome. You're in a different place now. And then, of course, I was just like at the age I was at, being somewhat of an educated person, I was always curious. I wonder what this is. I wonder what this is. I want to find out. Uh, and the other thing you need to keep in mind is, what is a medic? I didn't have a gun. I wasn't a grunt. I wasn't shooting the artillery or rifles or anything. A medic is a man who observes, who waits and watches for when he's needed, observing to see if someone is ill or wounded and what to do about it. So we were the keeping vigil. We were there. We were the watchers. We were the waiters and the helpers. So, for example, we had to be alert. We had to be sensitive. we had to think about it. Now, again, not all medics are exactly the same. Maybe there are some medics that might have been a bit crass and not very good at being a medic, but the ones I dealt with, for the most part, were wonderful. And we were the watchers. We were the helpers. I just wanted to be patient. I just wanted to work through the experience and do whatever I could. I wanted to do whatever I could to help people. Everything from sickness and wounds to just helping people in terms of keeping the records straight, being something of a clerk. And I thought, this is, I've always been this way. This is what I would be doing if I were in the Army. And here I am in the Army, of all places. So I think the idea of being a pacifist was there, but it was really a level of the unconscious with me. It was just part of my nature. I didn't think about it. I didn't brag about it. I mean, basically, I remember is again the non-commissioned officer who was the sergeant, Sergeant Finch. I loved him, wonderful guy in the tank battalion. He knew that I, among the other medics in his platoon, was 1AO, and he said, "I've served with a lot of you guys. You've all been wonderful." In other words, there was a sense that he knew he'd known other 1AO unarmed medics, and as well as the 1A armed medics, and we were treated the same. I did the best I could to survive and to help others survive.
You think that the respect you experience from others, although I wouldn't expect that a lot of soldiers would conceptualize it this way and really think it through, but do you think that the respect you experience from others came as a result that they understood, to kind of put it in philosophical terms, that you were not willing to knowingly, actively contribute to the suffering of the world, but you were willing to respond to and to accept the suffering of the world?
Something, I think so. It's something very much like that. Yes, I mean, I think that it's almost instinctive. The other men in the combat units or in the normal units, they might have been supply sergeants or they might have been grunts with guns and all that sort of thing. They really instinctively knew that medics had this status and medics had this role. It might have been, even if it was a 1A medic, not a 1AO, but even a 1A medic, the other soldiers instinctively knew that these people were supportive. The medics were a kind of a reassurance. You'd really want to be sure you had a medic if you're going into the field, because you didn't know what would happen. You also wanted to be reassured that the medic knew what the heck he was doing with dispensing booster shots for the vaccines, dispensing the anti-malaria pills, and the other things we did. A lot of what we did was kind of routines, like sick calls, we called it. So this, I think, was part of the part of how we were looked upon. This was part of the source of the special respect that we were given. It must have been around November of 70. The 25th Division was sent back to Hawaii. It was demobilized from Vietnam. So because I had a few months to go, I was transferred to the 15th Medical Battalion of the 1st Air Cavalry at Phu Phin, and that's where I ended up for the last 4 or 5 months, 4 months, I think, in Phu Phin until I deroast. So I deroast on February 17th of 1971. When in Phu Phin, I was again at the clearing station, at the aid station. This was more of like a mass unit, more like a clearing station than the battalion headquarters aid station of the tank battalion. So they had a ward. Sometimes people were sick there. They had they had people who were not badly wounded, but they were detoxing from drugs or maybe various things. But mainly it was a clearing station because wounded men would be brought in to by helicopter usually to this mass unit clearing station. They would be stabilized and dealt with by the real doctors, and then they would be shipped off to a proper hospital in Saigon, for more care. So that was what I was. So again, I was kind of like a desk clerk. I was doing sick call, uh, booster shots, routine things, giving advice, trying to help people. And the one thing that I did there that was for me the most upsetting and meaningful is that I had to identify cadavers whenever a body bag was brought in. It would be placed outside, right outside near where the helicopters were, and I would have to unzip and see if I could find any positive identification to write it down. It's like send the corpse on to the graves registration. Often I would always, if possible, I would get one of the chaplains to come and say some prayers. You know, if I could identify their religion, because the religion is usually on the dog tag. Protestant, Catholic, Episcopal, whatever it might be. So that was my final assignment. Again, as I was, a desk jockey to a certain extent, and once again, I patiently tried to do my best and be helpful. And it was my duty to, in addition to taking care of the living, to identify the dead.
When you're referring to identifying these cadavers, you said that it was upsetting and meaningful. And the upsetting part, I think, is pretty, that's fairly easy to understand why you would use that word. But use the word meaningful. What was it about this work? The upsetting part is clear. What was it about this work that was meaningful?
Well, it's hard to articulate. This was as much this was as much contact with violent death as I've ever had, you know, before or since. And it made me feel very, very strongly about the the value of life and the sacrifice that these men had made or been thrust upon them. It was you know a it was tragic, but it was also kind of a moral commitment. I mean, this what they paid. We talk about they paid the ultimate price, and you have to respect the man or woman or the person who paid the ultimate price, even though it came to them unbidden. They didn't ask for it, or they probably. So it was sobering. I think, of course, it's upsetting because of what it looked like, but it was also sobering. I thought it made me kind of meditative about the value of these people's lives and the value of what they had done. Something that's easy to get lost. You know, we don't we don't want to have wounded people around, and that sort of thing. And I say, yes, you do. This is a token. It's a reminder of what people are willing to sacrifice for the benefit of all, you know, or at least in terms of their loyalty, in terms of their patriotism. I mean, hugging a flag and is cheap, but realizing that men and women have suffered and or died, and then treating them with real affection and respect is fundamental. It's really a moral obligation that any decent person, patriotic, if you want to call it that, should have. I was very impressed with Vietnam as a beautiful country. I remember thinking, driving on a peaceful road. I was lucky on that regard. Like one of the trips from Tay Ninh to Cu Chi, just driving to do some business at the division headquarters as opposed to the battalion. I said, "This is a beautiful country. If there weren't a war going on, this would be a beautiful country to come and visit." But the whole experience, I just said, I have to endure. I just have to keep my wits about me. I have to be calm and proficient for the people I deal with. And I also need to defend my sanity, which is why I read a lot of books, which is why I wrote poems frequently, and wrote many letters. So the Vietnam, the 14 months and 10 days for me was kind of like a challenge. It was a test and a challenge. I was aware of the fragility and also the incredible value of time and endurance. Time mattered. It was a matter of enduring and keeping on top of things. And maybe by writing letters and poems, maybe by reading books like St. Thomas Aquinas or various things, was a way to protect myself, was a way to cope with both the tedium and the fear and horror as they interacted with each other.
What things did you learn in those 14 months about life, about people, that has been valuable to you as you've carried on in your life?
Well, because of the fact that there I was in the Army with, lifer NCOs, non-commissioned officers, with officers all the way from second lieutenant all the way up to colonel, whatever it might be, I learned about the diversity of attitude. There was a much more diverse world than the college, university, graduate school. Oddly enough, much more diverse world. I learned also that it would be possible to accept men, these are my colleagues in the Army, it'd be possible to accept men whom I would not otherwise deal with socially in the past. It made me not, I think I was always open minded, it made me more appreciative of the differences. Also, again, as I said earlier on, it also made me aware of the fact that, you can have two truths at the same time. You can have an absurd, futile, somewhat corrupt operation of war going on, and within it, quite a bit of honor and virtue in individual moments and individual people. And so, judge not lest ye be judged, as the good book says. It made me perhaps more tolerant, but again, also sensitive to human futility and human frailty.